Well, welcome everyone to this event of the Jewish Muslim Forum. This forum has existed for the last, I'd say, 8-10 years. Dr. Jacob Lebenz's predecessor, Helene Sinrich, who is now at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, she and I started this. And over the years, we tried to do it at least once a semester. Over the years, we have covered a lot of topics, great variety of them. Today's topic is an interesting one: the rise of religious conservatism in Israeli and Palestinian politics. This topic should intrigue many people. I have a couple of questions about this, which I'll ask toward the end of at the end of the presentations. To help us guide and navigate through this landscape, two experts on the subject. One is Professor Anwar Mahajani, who is an assistant professor of political science and the head faculty fellow for the Center for the Study of Race, Ethnicity, and Social Justice at Stonehill College. And she also serves on the Academic Council of American Friends of Combatants for Peace. And she does research in a number of areas, among them feminist, international relations, and cybersecurity, civil society, activism, political Islam, Middle East. He has done work on the well-known Egyptian religious cum political party, Ikhwan, which is the Muslim Brothers. Among her subjects also is gender politics and social movements. Then we have Professor Adam Fuller, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations at YSU. He writes and teaches about American and Israeli politics, and he is also a Schusterman Summer Institute Fellow at Brandeis University's Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He recently published a book on one of the subjects that he does research on. And I think without further ado, I'd like to invite our guest from Stonehill, Professor Anwar Mahajani, to talk to us for about 20 minutes. And Dr. Adam Fuller will do the same after this presentation. And then we'll have a question and answer session led by Dr. Jacob Lebenz. So may I request Professor Anwar Mahajani to start her presentation?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for the invite. I look forward to the conversation and listening to what Adam is going to say. I wanted to start out by providing some definitions, but I also want to say a little bit about me in relations to where kind of my background, not my academic background, but my lived experience, I guess. I'm Palestinian with Israeli citizenship. I come from a town called al-Fahim, which is north, but closer to the center of Israel. It's the home of the northern branch of the Islamic movement with Sheikh Ra'id Salah. I actually went to high school with his twin daughters. So I know at least the northern branch of the Islamic movement fairly well. My private high school was funded by the Islamic movement. So I do have direct experiences as well that kind of inspired my research. It didn't come out of a void, right? My interest in Islamist movements. I, of course, focus on gender. As Dr. Montasser said, I did some research on the Muslim Brotherhood. I have an article published with Religion and Politics. I have a few book chapters, and then a book is under review based on my dissertation work. A lot of it was based on interviews I did with women in the Muslim Brotherhood. The majority of them live in exile because of the security situation in Egypt right now against the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a fascinating, it's fascinating to relate a lot of these things, like just general understanding of political Islam and the Muslim Brotherhood to other Islamist groups. But again, I want to be careful not tying all these groups to the Muslim Brotherhood, because even though these groups learn from each other, not all of them have direct ties and similar agendas, as I will explain. Since we have a variety of people in the audience, students, people who are more knowledgeable than others, I wanted to kind of provide a few definitions for key terms that I am going to use. And I'm going to provide the definitions because knowing from my students that sometimes there's conflation when it comes to similar like terms that I think that I take for granted. So I want to make a difference between Islamic, Islamist, and Muslim, the three definition, right? Islamist is a group that actually wants to use Islam and Sharia, like they want to establish a state that Islam is at the base of it. Now, a lot of Arab states with Muslim majority do have some aspect of Sharia in them. So for instance, in Egypt, Article 2 says that Sharia law should be the law of the land. However, it depends on the implementation, right? In what aspects are we going to implement it? Islamist is more about kind of the governance. Islamic is anything that has Islamic values. It's about the values. And then Muslim is somebody who's practicing the faith. So we kind of just to distinguish the different categories when we talk about what is Islamist, what is Islamic, what is Muslim. Another thing that I want to clarify, there's a difference between Arab and Muslim. Arabs are not necessarily Muslims and Muslims are not necessarily Arabs. In Israel, for instance, about 21% of the population is Arab. A lot of them identify as Palestinian citizens of Israel. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you have questions about that. About the majority of them are Muslims, but about 7% are Christian. And then we have Druze and other groups, right? So kind of to say that not every Muslim is Arab and every Arab is Muslim. Also, we know that Iranians are Muslim, but they're not Arabs, Turks, and we can talk about the different categories, right? So just to distinguish a religious identity from an ethnic identity. So the Islamic movement, I wanted to talk about RAM, the United Arab List. And I thought it was fascinating what happened recently with them joining the government coalition is fascinating. And it has a lot to say about bodies of theories that have been studying Islamist movements and how kind of to moderate these groups. And one of the theories is the inclusion moderation theory, which means if religious or conservative groups engage in the democratic political process due to their interaction with different groups, leftist groups, they have to kind of make concessions in order to be able to gain wins. And that results in moderation. Now, the moderation could be strategic, but the strategic action could last and have a lasting impact on society. So for instance, I want to have women run just because I want to show that I'm more moderate, that people will vote for me. It will ease their fears about gender issues. So yes, maybe that's strategic. But in order for Islamists to actually justify electing the woman, they have to go and engage in an ideological process, explaining to the people that vote for them all the time, why is it okay for a woman to run for office? And in the process of doing so, they're changing norms as well in society. And that's important. Now that's being said, you need to have strong democratic institutions to make sure that nothing changes when these groups come into power, right? So not to change the constitution, not to change the whole structure. So just to give you a little bit of a background about RAM, which is kind of RAM is the political wing of the Southern Islamic movement. So for a lot of Islamic movements, they have a separate political wing. The Muslim Brotherhood, for instance, they had the Freedom and Justice Party, the political wing that they separated from the movement. And they do that for a variety of reasons, because the party has to do certain things that maybe the movement is not 100% in alignment with because of the political process. RAM, as I said, was associated with the southern branch of the Islamic movement. This branch broke off of the Islamic movement that was unified, and they broke off to northern branch and the southern branch. The reason they broke off is because of the Oslo Accord, and two, because of their views on engaging in the political process in the Israeli system, right? Their views about political participation in the Knesset. The northern branch did not want to run for Knesset. They view it as an illegitimate way to resist. They wanted to mainly focus, they had initiatives, for instance, to bring people to Al-Aqsa Mosque. They had Mahajani Al-Aqsa, the Al-Aqsa Festival every year. Sheikh Ra'id Salah ran that a few times. And then they focused mainly on their effort to protect what they call the Muqaddasat, the holy sites in Jerusalem. They ran for mayoral office in al-Fahim, the town where I grew up in, and they won elections for the longest time. Even the current mayor, he's not 100% affiliated with the Northern Branch since they have been outlawed. He kind of had some ties to Sheikh Ra'id Salah. Everyone in the town will tell you, like, everyone respects Sheikh Ra'id Salah, the head of the Northern Branch. Even when I interviewed people in Turkey from the Muslim Brotherhood, they knew his name, they knew who he was. Ram, which is, again, the political wing of the Southern Islamic movement, not the Northern one, which does not run for election, focuses mainly on social economic issues for Palestinian citizens. They have a very conservative cultural outlook, and sometimes that is at odds with secular Arab parties such as Khadash, which have feminist supporters. They advocated for women's issues, LGBTQI rights issues. So sometimes they were at odds. Just to tell you a little bit too about the founder of the movement. The founder of the movement, the Southern Branch. So remember I said the Northern and Southern Branch separated, but the main founder for both before separation was Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish. And he actually, after being imprisoned, because initially he did ask for kind of more aggressive measures for promoting Islamic principles and kind of resistance against the state. After he was imprisoned, he changed course, and he believed that the best way to improve the conditions is through political engagement. Abbas, the leader of Ram and the one in the Knesset, we hear his name all the time if you're keeping up with Israeli politics. People hailed him as the kingmaker in the last election, after Israel had 4 failed elections in like less than 2 years. And he was the one that finally allowed the government coalition to come to existence, which is very unusual. Arabs have been out of government coalition for a long time. The last time that they cooperated was with Yitzhak Rabin in the 90s, but they weren't inside the coalition. They supported him from outside. So that's a big move that really, it hasn't been done in decades for them to join a government coalition. And I'm sure Professor Fuller will talk about it, with Yisrael Beitenu, which is also considered a conservative Zionist group that is not Israel Beitenu. What's the party I'm thinking about? The party that, what's his name? I don't know, I'm blanking out on his name.
Yamina,
yes. So the settlement issue seemed to have compromised on that, which is interesting. So Abbas joined the Islamic movement, even though he mainly focuses on the Bedouin community in the south. He lived in a Druze majority town in northern Israel. It's called Al-Maghar. But the main constituency for the Southern Branch lives in the south. There are Bedouin conservative communities that are facing a variety of issues related to housing, access to electricity, unrecognized villages, etc. So Abbas joined the Islamic movement when he was studying dentistry at the Hebrew University in mid-1990 after meeting Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish. And if you look up at articles that kind of profile him after becoming a kingmaker, he always cites Abdullah Nimr Darwish as his main intellectual influences. So Ram ran for election a few times in 1999, 2006, 2009, 2013, and eventually they ran as members of the Joint List. That happened in 2015. Now, the Joint List has secular Arab parties. They diverge on a lot of issues, from the question of what's the final solution should look like, one state, two state. more communist parties like Hadash, more nationalist parties like Balad, and then we have conservative groups like Gram. So of course there was tension. The reason why they came together, despite the kind of the a variety of ideologies that exist, because strategically that made sense, especially in 2015. What happened is that electoral threshold increased from 2% to 3.25%. And a lot of these parties didn't get more than 30%, right, of the vote, meaning that they wouldn't make it to the Knesset. So when they came together, they kind of made gains, 13 to 15 seats. 15 was the maximum they've gotten. So they did make gains. So strategically, the move made sense. However, they eventually split up ahead of the March 2020 elections, the last one. They previously ran with Balad in the May 2019 elections as part of the joint Balad-Ram list. Now, their views, they have a few views. Let's start with the Palestinian issue, right? Ram supports the establishment of a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. They do, at least in their charter, talk about the end of the occupation and dismantling of the settlements. They do seek for the release of Palestinian prisoners and the return of Palestinian refugees. They are for maintaining the status quo in the in Jerusalem, so meaning the Jewish community will pray on the Western Wall, Muslims will pray inside the mosque, but the Jewish worshippers can go in. They did ask, in contradiction to what we heard from Israeli officials, Ram, Chair Mansour Abbas, actually asked for the reopening of the US consulate in Jerusalem. If you're following the news, now the Biden administration wants to open the consulate, but they're trying to convince Israel that it's the move that needs to happen with their support. So we see the split there, because Ram says, yeah, go open it, while the government says no. They do heavily focus on the Palestinian citizens of Israel. They advocate for the recognition of Israeli Arabs as national minority. They seek to ensure their rights in kind of a legal way. Ram calls for closing the gaps in Arab educational system and support both the establishment of Arab university and the development of industrial zones, especially close to Arab towns. They mainly focus on issues related to Negev Bedouins. They are the majority of the votes come from the Naqab, the Negev. Again, as I said, it's a conservative Bedouin community that is very key constituency for Ram. Even though there are some similarities and differences between Ram and the Joint List, the differences reached attention. First of all, some people cite the LGBTQI issue. So Hadash with Aida Toma is one of the Arab women MKs, actually voted with other people in the party for a law or against a law that legalizes conversion to LGBTQI people. So Mansour Abbas expressed support for the conversion therapy. He argued and disagreed with other Joint List members over refusing to support conversion therapy, which is kind of a very controversial issue in conservative societies when it comes to LGBTQI issues. Now, a lot of people ask me, how about women's rights? And I mean, where do they stand? So I always tell them, with women's rights, there's always room for negotiation, but with LGBTQI rights, it's a more controversial issue than women's rights. So a lot of Islamist parties came to the conclusion that they could allow women's participation in the public sphere, so voting, running for office, as long as their duties at home are still intact. So when I talk always to the Muslim Brotherhood, they always talk about complementarity, right? Not full equality. And all the women that I interviewed would say, well, my husband is okay with it, and I fulfilled my duties toward my kids, so I'm doing my duty toward the public. So kind of that's one way that, you know, they will compromise on women's issues. And I don't know if you know, but one of the first female MKs to wear the hijab actually comes from Ram. So there is a woman wearing the hijab right now in Israeli Knesset, which is fascinating phenomenon, right? So again, that was the highest tension, but the joint list would say, no, that wasn't true. It wasn't over LGBTQI issues. It was more over his attempt to kind of coordinate and cooperate with Netanyahu. And the Arab list was in a very tough position after recommended Gantz, but then he eventually decided to have an agreement with Netanyahu, which we know didn't end well for Gantz. So that put Ayman Odeh and the rest in a tough position. So achievements since they joined the coalition. The government legalized 3 unrecognized Bedouin villages in the southern Negev desert. Sorry, how am I doing on time? Good.
It's about 2 minutes, 3 minutes left.
Okay, I guess I can cover some of it later, but let me kind of outline some of the accomplishments. They legalized 3 unrecognized Bedouin villages in the southern Negev desert. That was one of the key demands that Ram had before joining the coalition. The recognized villages have about 4,000 Bedouins that live in it, so that's an accomplishment. The government also advanced a proposal for a new planned Bedouin municipality in the south. Ram, controversially, Mansour Abbas was against a proposal put by the joint list to build a hospital in Sakhnin, an Arab town in the north. But the MK Mazen Ghanayim from Ram split from the movement, from the party, and voted for it. So the hospital is going to be built, which a lot of people were very upset with him over that. They addressed inequality. So the government pledged more than 30 billion national Israeli shekel to bridging the gaps between the Jewish and Arab sector. The money will go toward economic development, job training, innovation, high tech, and then for education and healthcare systems. The government also allocated 2.5 billion shekels for fighting crime in the Arab sector. Now, some people claim that Israel had to do that after the May event. I don't know if you saw reports of the communal violence on the ground and how bad it got between the Palestinian community in Israel and the Jewish community in Israel, where kind of the illusion of coexistence was shattered. There are other kind of controversial bills that Ram was trying that passed. One of them is connecting unrecognized villages to national electric grid. Why is it controversial? Because they're illegal according to the state, so they don't get electricity. But Ram was able to get at least half of these places connected to electricity, or at least passed a bill that will allow them to do so. Controversy when it comes to cannabis. The Shura Council said no, don't support a law that would legalize medical cannabis, but Mansour Abbas supported it. So these are kind of fascinating dynamics that you can see happening. I wanted to talk about their position on Gaza and Hamas, but we can talk about it maybe in the Q&A. Hamas is not happy with Mansour Abbas. They said that, I think the quote says, the way to deal with the occupation is through struggle and conflict, not through coexistence. And that's from the deputy head of Hamas's political wing. But yeah, I think I'll stop here.
Okay.
Yeah, our next speaker is Professor Adam Fuller, and we look forward to his observations.
All right, so this right here is the American political spectrum. It is a very simple bell curve. You have the left, you have the right, far left, far right, and the center, and most people fall somewhere within the center. Now I'm going to go ahead and draw you the Israeli political spectrum. That's it right there. That's the Israeli political spectrum. There's a vast multitude of bell curves. a vast multitude of left and rights across the spectrum and a center within each one. So the topic of this discussion is religious conservatism in Israeli and Palestinian politics. Religious conservatism means something different in Israel, depending upon what community you belong to. It's not like in the United States where we know what a religious conservative is, right? Or we have some idea, or there's some kind of commonality between one religious conservative and the next, just to a great degree. Obviously, there are exceptions and anomalies to everything. But for the most part, we understand what that means in the American context. In the Israeli context, that is not the case at all. There is not a consistent basis to what makes someone a religious conservative in Israel. Because what it is that each of these communities seek to conserve is different depending upon what context you're talking about, what community it is that you're talking about. We cannot even say that Zionism is a fundamental principle that each community is trying to conserve. The only thing that we might say has some realm of consistency among them is that to a certain degree, Torah values are something that they want to conserve. But what Torah values are will differ from one community to the next. And one of the big reasons for that disparity of even how to understand Torah values is this other thing called Zionism, which is basically nationalism for the Jewish people, the belief that the Jewish people should have a homeland there in Israel, and that it is something special and sacred to the Jewish people and needs to be fought for and preserved. But we cannot even describe Zionism as necessarily conservative because of two factors. One, there are many religious conservatives in Israel who are not Zionists, and in fact are anti-Zionist. Secondly, there are left-wing Zionists, right, in Israel, right? There is a left-wing Zionist bloc in Israel, as they have differences of how that Zionism ought to be applied and practical considerations from the right-wing bloc, but Zionism is shared by the political left-wing parties, or many of them in Israel. So it is hard, you cannot say that Zionism is conservative. We tend to have that misconception in America, that looking at Israel, that Zionism is some kind of conservative ideology that right-wing Israelis believe in, and that is not the case. And actually, Zionism in its origins was something very radical and very revolutionary. In fact, it was opposed largely by people who were conservative because of its radical and revolutionary character. It was about the creation of the new Jew, right? A new Jew who can believe put aside thousands of years of tradition and recreate something that makes them Jewish, and create new Jewish attributes, new Jewish characteristics, make Jews more geared towards farming and agriculture, and more geared towards physical labor and things like that. The creation of this idea of the new Jew, it was a radical concept. And it was also radical because it meant actually doing something that much of the Jewish world, if not at the time, we're talking about the late 19th century, early 20th, blasphemous. The idea that the Jewish people being in exile can be brought out of exile back into their homeland through conscious human efforts. No, we got to wait until God brings us, Hashem brings us back to our promised land. We got to wait for the Messiah. It's not up to us as human beings to do God's work like that. So many believe that it was blasphemous. So because it rebrands Judaism, and because it, for many, kind of replaces the idea that we have to wait for the Moshiach, for the Messiah, and do what we were promised is going to happen by God, but do it ourselves. That a lot of people felt was blasphemous. It went against a religious Torah-based framework, went against Torah-based Judaism. So in and of itself, Zionism is not a part of the Jewish Articles of Faith as Maimonides enumerated them. And I'm focusing on the Orthodox here and not, say, the more progressive strands of Judaism, because this topic is religious conservatism, right? So we're talking mainly about this kind of Jew, the one that prays 3 times a day, keeps Shabbos, keeps kosher, strict adherence to Jewish law. So there are then religious Zionists and there are religious anti-Zionists, and both of them could be said to be conservative in very different ways. So a religious Zionist comes in many different forms. There are many different kinds of people that are religious Zionists. Most or a great majority of them in Israel are modern Orthodox, right? They're fully, enmeshed in modern secular society. They dress like any other Israeli would, and they wear a kippah. That would be the only thing probably that distinguishes them from other Israelis. And many of them are of liberal strands of Hasidim, right? So like the Chabad, like the Lubavitchers would be religious Zionists, and Kahanas, a very militant wing of religious Zionists who are devotees of Rabbi Meir Kahana, who wrote a book called Never Again, which inspired a lot of people to be very militant in their devotion to Zionism and to defending against what they understand as anti-Semitism. So for these particular religious Zionists, who in this broad camp, I guess we would say that they're inspired by some of the early Zionist writers like Rav Kook and people like that, who wanted to say that actually religious religious Judaism does remain consistent with Zionism, that it's not inconsistent, that actually we are still allowing God to do his work, but through us, right? That we are God's vehicle. Then, of course, you have the Haredim, and there are a lot of Haredim in Israel. Those are the people that you see. The men are wearing long black coats and they have long sideburns known as payas, and they're often wearing black hats or furry round hats. You can't miss them. They're known as Haredim. The word in Hebrew means people who tremble, one who trembles. They are distinguished by a very strict adherence to Jewish law, of devotion to Jewish mysticism. They follow a Rebbe, that is their leader, their spiritual leader in their communities. And they are also, for the most part, anti-Zionist. They believe that Zionism is blasphemy. The notion that we can't wait for God to bring us out of exile is blasphemous. So they don't really take Zionist ideology very seriously. They often are very much against it, and many of them don't even want to have anything to do with the state of Israel itself. They live there because there really isn't anywhere else for them to go, but they live there in very large communities in Jerusalem, in other villages and cities like Bet Shemesh, and a variety of others. So those are the two communities. The religious Zionists are very right-wing in their politics. They live in many parts of Israel, including the Negev. There's a growing population of them in the Negev, many in Jerusalem, and many outside the Green Line in the West Bank. And these are those that you often hear of referred to as settlers that live in settlements. Some are Kahanas, and a lot of the folks that Anwar was talking about in the skirmish, that the Jews that were causing this to happen were of the Kahanas variety. Naftali Bennett is not a Kahanist, but Naftali Bennett, the current Prime Minister of Israel, is, you could describe him as a religious Zionist of the modern Orthodox variety. And in fact, he is the first Orthodox prime minister that Israel has ever had. He wears a kippah. He's the first prime minister that you'll see wearing a kippah, and he keeps kosher, and he observes Shabbat, and he probably prays 3 times a day. The Haredim, though, are historically anti-Zionist, as I said, but over time, many even though they're not supportive of the Zionist ideology, they tended to be comfortable with Zionism, and they don't really argue too much with it. They did more in the old days. There are still many who argue about it, but to a large extent, they don't. There are several things that make them, distinguish them, at least in Israeli politics. So first of all, the Rabbanim, that is the Jewish rabbinate in Israel, is comprised largely of, entirely of Haredim. The rabbis are Haredi, and there are 2 rabbinates. There's the Sephardic, and then there's the Ashkenaz, and they're both Haredi. The rabbinate, I wouldn't describe Israel as a theocracy, but it is to a limited degree, in the sense that the rabbinate does have quasi-constitutional power over matters of personal status, like marriage, burial, divorce, those kinds of things. And so anybody that is a Jew in Israel has to go through the Jewish rabbinate to get married or to get divorced. And anybody that is Muslim has to go through the Islamic clergy for that, right? And anybody who's Christian has to go through a Christian clergy to go through that. So you're distinguished by what your personal status is religiously, and the Jewish rabbinate handles that for the Jews, and they are controlled by Haredim. So the politics of the non-Haredi in Israel has been largely a backlash to the tremendous power that is wielded by the Haredim. And I think to a large degree, my personal take is that to a large degree, much of it has been unnecessarily hostile, and some of it has been fair, right? That there are valid criticisms that have been made and invalid criticisms that have been made. But the way that they are seen, and much of this is valid, is that the Haredim have traditional attitudes that have become a source of significant problems in the Israeli public square. They've had problems where the men did not want to sit next to women on buses, problems with a complete inability to tolerate secular Jews even being close to their communities at all. They have a very strict point of view about the family and the the relationship between men and women and all that. And also they receive exemptions for their conscription into the Israeli Defense Force. That's because military service interferes with their daily Torah learning, and because they're concerned that they're not going to get kosher food in the mess halls. And also they receive public funding for their Torah learning in their yeshivas. All this except for the Haredi women, who have their own set of problems. They are more educated also than the Haredi men, because they are not learning in the yeshiva. They're going to study in a university, so they're more educated in the secular subjects. So all this has been a source of anger by pretty much everybody else, who really want the Haredim to pull their weight. And to stop having this kind of vast control over the rabbinate. But the problem is that the Haredim have always had a very considerable amount of power in Israel, primarily because of their numbers. Now, originally, when Israel was established in 1948, there were only a few hundred Haredim in Israel. And David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister, he was very devoted to labor Zionism. He didn't think that Torah-based Judaism was going to last. He thought it was going to dissipate pretty quickly. Zionism was going to erase, labor Zionism in particular was going to erase it. But boy, was he wrong. The Haredim have a lot of children. And so the numbers of them have greatly expanded, now to the point where they make up a very sizable proportion of the Israeli electorate. So they're good in every election for winning about 16 or 17 seats total between the two parties. So they've really grown in number. And after every election, they remain a force to contend with. And Netanyahu, like every other prime minister previously, has worked with them because they really don't have much of a choice in the matter to work with them and allow them to sit with them in the government. And they're willing to sit with the left or the right? They adhere to the right social views, but they like the economic views of the left because they're going to give them money for the yeshivas and for housing and all of those things. So as long as they're getting those kinds of things from the government, they'll sit with anybody. And they want their IDF exemptions to be preserved as well. All those, and their control over the rabbinate. Now this brings us up to date. I'll speed right through now. I only have a couple minutes left. This brings us to current events. So Yesh Atid is one of the big players in the current coalition, as is Yisrael Beiteinu. Now, Yisrael Beiteinu is a secular conservative party, and Yesh Atid is a secular centrist party. Both parties have, over the years, been very much against the Haredim and really want the Haredim out of the government. It is one of the big reasons why Israel has not been able to successfully form a coalition, why there has been a deadlock in 4 consecutive elections. And this last election, they were able to put a government together without the Haredim. And it's interesting to me that this happened because of the United Arab List. As Anwar put it, Ra'am has joined the coalition. They only have Anwar, it's like 4 seats, right? 4 seats. But the 4 seats was necessary to put this government over the threshold and form a government. And what I find very interesting, and it's one of the reasons why I thought this would be a really interesting topic for discussion, is that for me it's interesting because with the Haredim out of the government, which is a rare thing, they actually, even though they may have some concern about keeping the things that they want to preserve for themselves, it's actually the United Arab List that's going to help conserve those things for them, because the United Arab List wants to preserve the strength of the Islamic clergy, over matters of personal status for Muslims in Israel. They're also for the social conservative issues like banning cannabis and making sure that there's no civil marriage, no gay marriage. Women's rights are not going to be expanded. LGBT rights are not going to be expanded, and all of these other social issues. So it's interesting to me that it's actually the Arab Islamist party that saves the day for the Haredim in Israel.
Thank you very, very much, both of you, for fascinating and complimentary presentations.
Yes, yes.
I
agree.
Sure, sorry.
I agree. I agree.
And I'm sure that many of you who are watching, unfortunately, we can't see your faces. As I explained, when some of you were here earlier and could hear us preparing, we used to use an open Zoom format in my last discussion with Dr. Fuller, when we were discussing his recent book, Israel and the Neoconservatives, Zionism and American Interests. We were Zoom bombed at the end. It wasn't so bad, but it was enough to want to avoid it this time. So I ask you now, if you have any questions for the panelists, you may enter it into the Q&A section, and I will read them verbatim if I can. If there are some sort of mistakes, I will try to form them into more properly formed questions. But until we do, first, I'd like to point out, Dr. Fuller reminded me, he is teaching a course on Israeli politics this coming spring. There is still time to enroll in that course and space in the course. It features a fantastic event, a model Knesset, a model Israeli parliament, where students take on the roles of different political parties, and they start the horse trading that we've seen 4 times in 2 years to form a government, and it can be very difficult in the state of Israel. And other students have in the past played journalists, releasing news briefs to which the class participants must respond. I got to participate last time when a student didn't show up, and I got to represent some fun political parties. Seeing as there are no questions, perhaps I'll start it off with a question of my own. And it actually comes, resonates with the criticism from Hamas. So this is clearly for Dr. Mahajani. You've expressed that the Southern religious conservative, the Southern Islamist parties want eventually to see a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. They also, as you've shown, have more immediate priorities, whether it is investment into infrastructure in Arab communities or something else, or the maintenance of certain religious prerogatives for clerical elites. So the question that I have is, how do they want to get there from here, right? How do you get a state by working in a Knesset, which is overwhelmingly antagonistic to the idea of a Palestinian state, or can be?
Yeah, so with Jerusalem, I think they mean like dividing Jerusalem to East and West Jerusalem. But it is an interesting question that people have been trying to figure out with Mansour Abbas and his strategy there. Like, what are you trying to accomplish and how? And I don't know if you heard about the interview one of the members of Ra'am had with an Israeli news station, where he said if a war with Gaza happens again, then that wouldn't risk the coalition and its stability. But when he said that the best approach is to eventually reach an agreement that is good for Palestinians and the security of Israeli society. So they're very, very vague about the terms of how they view that to happen. I really don't think they are compromising on the two-state solution in that sense. But again, we saw more settlements being approved, I think this week, to be built. And then it's just kind of the weird dance that him and Ayelet Sheked are playing right now, where she's approving unrecognized Bedouin villages, and then she's approving also settlements that are happening. So it's very contradictory, not clear. I'm not sure he's really thinking about that as much, because his constituency is really focused mainly on issues, with gun violence in the community, it's a very important issue right now, and it's a very severe issue. And I think his constituency is actually asking for that. I saw a survey saying that about 46% of Arabs in Israel do want, somebody in the coalition to achieve these domestic demands. So I think that's what they're focused on. The Palestinian question, I think they're pushing it off. Maybe till Yair Lapid comes in the rotation, or somebody that is more leftist than Bennett, right? So I'm assuming they're deferring that since they know that there is a rotation. There's like different times to discuss different issues at the moment.
We have our first question in the chat. I'll read it verbatim. I'm going to have to look aside to my other screen. I apologize. Do you think that a multi-ethnic state of Israel is possible where both ethno-religious groups could coexist? Or would cultural values get in the way and a two-state solution is the only way to solve the problem? Both people have similar customs, languages, and religious values, yet do not focus on their similarities. And I think it would be interesting to hear from both of our speakers on this.
So I guess I want a clarification before I answer this. Are we talking about including the West Bank and Gaza, and then if we do have a two-state solution, are we talking about taking the Palestinian community or not moving borders or transferring the Palestinian community to these states? It depends.
Interesting. Okay. So you can answer it right at your clarification as a new question, if you don't mind.
I mean, I could talk about both options.
Yeah, I think that would be fine too.
Okay. So in my ideal world, one state for everyone, where some sort of confederacy or that would happen, that would be ideal in my world. Because honestly, with the settlement expansion, and if you look at the geography, a two-state solution with also like, recognizing Jerusalem, the Trump declaration, all of it is pushing us far away from the two-state solution. And for me, having a one-state solution would be ideal. Now, I've heard a few proposals. One, two-state solutions where the settlers could be included in the Palestinian state, right, with rights, minority rights, as the Palestinians in Israel have rights inside of Israel, which is an interesting one. A lot of people are concerned that if we do have a two-state solution, then what will happen to the Palestinians inside of Israel? Will they be asked to push out and lose their citizenship access? I call it it would be a third Nakba, because then you won't be able to access the same areas the same way. You're going to be disconnected from families living in mixed cities, right? So it has its own implications. And then if we do want to say just a completely Palestinian state, leave Israel the way it is, or exchange a few pieces of land for settlements, then that also has a problem in its own. So do I have an answer? No, I don't know if anything is possible anytime soon.
Well, I refer back to what I said before at the outset, that this is this political spectrum in Israel. And this is also, I think Anwar might agree, the political spectrum among the Palestinians as well. So given that there are so many different factions with so many different takes on the matter, it's probably not possible to have a one-state solution. Maybe you've got one faction on both sides that want something like that to happen, but it's not enough to make it work. And Anwar, of course, correctly identified all of the logistical problems associated with that. The Israeli Arab population that lives primarily within that triangle region, they don't want to move. They want to stay where they're at. Right. So, and then of course you have the question of can Jews live on the Palestinian side if there is some kind of confederation? Will everybody have freedom of movement within this single state? If the answer to that is no, then this is not a single state. Right. This is not a multi-ethnic state if the answer to that is no. And if you're asking me, do I think that there could ever be a state in which there would be full rights of movement for every single citizen, regardless of whether they're Jewish or Muslim, Christian, Bedouin, Druze, whatever. I don't really see it happening. I think that the best alternative is the two-state solution. Obviously, we are a long way from seeing something like that happen, but I think if you ask me, it's more feasible than a one-state solution.
Even though to highlight that there are lots of Jewish activists on the left who are pushing for, one democratic state. There are activists who are, like, I interviewed Jewish activists for my podcast where they live in Tel Aviv, but they say they live in Palestine. So I do notice that there is that, the Jewish left that is changing. Also, we notice a change in the views of American Jews and how they're different now when it comes to questions of, Israel, the occupation, and using more critical language of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. So I do notice some shifts. I don't know if you also saw with the New York Times, for instance, they just published, we saw the cover after during the war, of course, but then recently they've been publishing documentaries about Hebron, and like you see it more becoming, like the Palestinian cases becoming more popular or getting decent coverage, let's say, in media outside of Israel. We also notice a shift in Israeli media due to what happened in May, that they're pushing for engagement of Arabs and the different narratives to be presented in Israeli media. So I do notice small shifts. I can't say they're gonna cause radical change just yet, but not to kind of say it's hopeless. I don't wanna end it
I
that
agree
way.
with you that there are these small shifts. And you mentioned the Hadash party in your talk. Hadash is actually not even an Arab party. It's Arab and Jews that are together, right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I interviewed Aida Toma and I asked her exactly, like, what do you think of Ram? I think she said something interesting. She said, Mansour Abbas, he gave up and he just he like acknowledges that he's a second-class citizen and he's operating from that position. And that's an interesting point because he is making lots of compromises, right? That I find very interesting. But that's their position on that issue as well. But they do want a two-state solution. They are people like Aida Toma, they're feminists, they're socialists, they're all of these things as well.
I'm not muted, good. There was a question in the chat, what is your podcast? I looked on your Twitter, it is the @OliveBranchPod, but and I put that in the chat. Is there another way to find it?
It's on iTunes, it's on Spotify, so it should be available anywhere.
Great. And I've also put in the chat the website of the Center for Judaic and Holocaust Studies, so people can keep up with our events. I'm not ending the discussion now, I'm just responding to something, an immediate request for information. Dr. Mir, do you have any questions?
Yes. One is religious conservatism in Israeli and Palestinian politics. Is there a regional or even international political context to it? One. And two, what is the long-term prognosis of this?
So in what sense?
How is it going to pan out in the end? It's not a temporary phenomenon, I guess. It's going to last for a long time. With what implications? With what impact?
So the geographic context, I can talk definitely. Of course, I mean we can't separate the historical context of Israel becoming a state and different factions, but of course. If you look at groups like, so for instance, Hezbollah and Hamas were founded right after Israel's invasion of southern Lebanon, right? They were influenced by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood as an important, the Iranian Revolution inspired a lot of Islamist groups to think that, oh, now it's possible for Islamist groups to make change and even, run a government. Then, of course, we had the first Intifada that played a big factor in why, why the southern branch of the Islamic movement decided, and Arab parties in general decided to run for election and have their own separate parties because they felt their marginalization on both the Palestinian side and the Israeli side. So in a lot of discussions about, two-state solution, one-state solution, usually the Palestinian community in Israel is like not referred to. I even talked to people in J Street. I was like, so what do you think should happen to Palestinians in Israel? And they said, we haven't thought about it. And that could be dangerous, right? In the deal of the century, Trump said, oh, these communities, like the triangle area the borders should be moved. Oh, you're not moving people, you're just moving borders. But it has drastic implications to the livelihood of people, right? It's not just that. So you notice that there are lots of things that are happening with the Islamist movement, but also with Israeli politics at the same time that are emerging. And also because a lot of these parties that initially emerged were secular, as I said, and honestly don't represent the majority of the population. There is divergent within the Palestinian community in Israel, even though a lot of people tend to put all the views under like one umbrella, the joint list, but that's not true. As I said, about 46% of people wanted a party to join the coalition, the Israeli coalition, even though Balad and Hadash and all of them didn't want to, right? So it's important to kind of note all these different dynamics, regional and also inside of Israel, that resulted in the decision that Ram eventually joined the coalition.
Hypothetically speaking, if the religious conservative Palestinian party leaves the coalition, what's going to happen?
Although we're going to have another election. And even then we won't have it will be the same problem.
But I don't think that they're going to leave the coalition. I think that, interestingly, I think that Ra'am is the party that Bennett can count on the most to stay in. And he would, Mansour Abbas would have joined any coalition. He would have joined it with Netanyahu. He would have joined it with Gantz.
Mm-hmm.
He joined it with Bennett. He didn't care. He'll join any coalition. What he wants is to get something for his sector. And he knows that the only way he's going to get any leverage at all is agreeing to be part of the coalition that could fall at any time if he doesn't get what he wants. But he's a smart and prudent man in that he knows that there's still a limit as to what he can achieve. And he's not going to ask for things that are unachievable. He's looking at it through the lens of what is feasible. I think that they can count on him remaining in. Yeah, I think the real problem is labor or Meretz being the ones to leave.
And that's the statement that were made publicly by Mansour Abbas and other members. They said the coalition is not in any danger, especially now with the bill, the money and funding and recognizing the villages, as well as allowing electricity to go to unrecognized villages. So that's a big step. It's interesting. Yes, he's making gains, but I'm not sure the bigger picture. I'm still kind of cautious to be optimistic about the big.
I think that we'll know more on that front after this budget debate has been finalized and he actually gets what he wants.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, another thing that they accomplished, first of all, with Abbas being in the government, it changed the discourse about Palestinians in Israel, inside of Israel, about the importance of these parties. You mentioned Kahana, and I kept thinking of Ben Gvir, his latest attack against Arab MKs, where he said, "You're here by mistake." Ben Gurion made a mistake, and that's why you're here in the Knesset. So even Kahana people are in the Knesset, right? And they're even though they do exist, Abbas and people and Ayman Aoud and all of them kind of are disrupting or kind of making them uncomfortable, which I do like.
They are outside the coalition.
Yeah.
Yes, they are in the Knesset.
They're making them uncomfortable, which I mean, Netanyahu was talking to Ben Gvir too, so.
So there's another set of questions in the chat. And I'm going to skip to the second one because the person who posed the first one has already asked the question. Recently, I was asked a question, the student writes. The question was, what is the difference between religion and politics? I thought about the question, and I thought that the question should be rephrased a different way. I think they were really what they were really asking was, what is the significance between religion and politics? Or how does one impact the other? What would both speakers agree with how I thought about the question? And should we always look at the coalition of the state of Israel through that framework?
Is this a student in my religion and politics class?
No, this one is one of my students.
Oh,
The question is, religion and politics are very interrelated. Even in the US, when we talk about separation of church and state, you can always go and look at the evangelical vote and then where the money comes from these religious groups. So also look at the pro-life, pro-choice debate, right? It's funded by what? It's all religious discourses that are funded by religious groups. Now, I do teach religion and politics, and I highly think they're connected. It shapes the way you view the world, how you vote. Churches, mosques, synagogues are important places to mobilize people to care about certain issues, engage in politics. I know some research was done about mosques that they increase participation of the Muslim community in American politics. So religion is very interrelated, even if we do claim that we have separation between religious institutions and secular or state institutions. Now, in countries like Israel and other countries where they don't really talk about full separation, religion even plays a bigger part in these areas. So Adam talked about kind of the personal status law being controlled by the clergy, which is true, and that's shaping a lot of the work that these religious parties are focused on. The work of Mansour Abbas and the separation related to LGBTQI rights, women's rights, also influences a lot of their decisions to engage or not engage. Religious philosophy is important as well. So yeah, and I think I like the way you framed the question.
I think there is a very there is a tremendous tension between religion and secularism in Israel, just as there is here in the United States. A culture war between the two. Religion and politics are greatly intertwined because both government and religion are sources of authority. They are sources of rule upon the individual, rule upon communities of people in their own ways. And we like in our modern day to, in a society of modern liberalism, we like to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's, and never the twain shall meet. But unfortunately, that's not always feasible.
Okay, there's another question. Is the southern branch of the Islamist movement in Palestine and Israel more similar to the standard conservative, to a standard conservative party, however you'll interpret that, or a far-right religious group like Hamas?
So definitely I wouldn't compare them to Hamas because again, they have shown that they're more interested in engaging in the democratic process. They've been very pragmatic about approaching the political game in Israel, and their focus seems to be on Palestinians inside of Israel, even though their general views about the conflict is, as I said, two-state solution, addressing the occupation, etc. But it seems their main focus is now domestically. Even when it comes to women, when their conservatism is less conservative, social conservatism is less conservative than Hamas when it comes to a lot of issues as well. So I don't think they're comparable, but do they, you know, kind of have the same principles when, you know, inspirations about Sharia law and all these aspects too, but it's about the strategy itself that is different, and also the application of the law. How are they interpreting the text is different.
I'm not going to weigh in on this one. I don't know.
There's nothing more in the chat. Masanza, do you have any?
No, I think they've. Is this? I think I asked it before, but once again, this a growing or a diminishing phenomenon, and whichever it is, what are the causes? In either case,
What phenomena?
religious conservatism.
Mm-hmm.
I don't. I don't see it subsiding. I see it taking different shapes, at least not in the Palestinian community in Israel. So if you ask anyone, are you religious? They would always tell you yes, but they apply it differently, right? What does that mean? You have conservatives who are conservative when it comes to, let's say, women's issues, but they're more open-minded about, education, social interaction, politics. So it depends. And I think the new generation is more sophisticated about their understanding of religion and politics. I'm noticing that they do look at religion as an important compass, but they also want to make sense of modernization, of globalization, of interaction, secular education and all of that. So you see it translating in interesting ways where, for instance, Arab women in Israel are highly educated in comparison to men, right? They do go to work, they vote, they do all of that, but the family structure is still very hierarchical in that sense. So it just translates differently. And you see the mothers like wearing the veil, the girls are not, they're praying, but they're not wearing the veil. So it's kind of different. Some people don't pray, but they're very conservative about other things.
I think on the Jewish side, it is growing for two main reasons. First of all, if you're talking about the Haredim, their population is growing and it will continue to grow. Secondly, if you talk about the rest of the Jewish population in Israel, it's interesting because everywhere else in the world, young people are liberal, right? And older people are conservative, and young people are very progressive-minded, very radical. That's not the case in Israel. In Israel, it's really the other way around. It's the older baby boom generation that's liberal and it's kind of still sort of a remnant of the old labor Zionism age, whereas the young people there are, at least in terms of economic and classical liberal kinds of ideas, very interested in maintaining things like the free market. They're risk takers, they're entrepreneurs. They're the ones in the quote unquote startup nation that you read about, that they're the ones that are doing that. And politically, in the way that we see young people in Israel vote, they tend to vote with the right-wing bloc. And this is the case with Ashkenazi and Sephardi, more so Sephardic actually, but even Ashkenazi. The thing is though, they're primarily Likudniks, which they're not very religious. So I wouldn't call this religious conservatism. It's more like today the American Republican Party, right? That's what the kind of conservatism they're embracing. But even the secular young people learn their ideas about Jewish religion from the Orthodox. When I was over there on a study tour a few years ago, one of the members of our cohort was a woman rabbi, an American woman rabbi, and she was wearing a kippah. And we were this wouldn't happen in Tel Aviv, but we were somewhere, I remember where it was, but it wasn't one of the big cities. And a young guy who wasn't religious at all, very secular, starts asking her questions like this was wrong for a woman to be wearing a kippah. And the guy's not even religious. He's just learning his ideas about the distinctions between the roles of men and women from the religious. So I think it expands in that sense that the young people they get their, at least in Israel, not in the US, but in Israel, they're getting their understanding of what it means to be a Jew from the religious side.
Yeah, and it also doesn't help that a lot of secular parties have failed to accomplish what people wanted them to accomplish. And also, like we're talking about the Palestinian parties in Israel, a lot of people weren't happy with that, with the joint lists for a lot of reasons. But also, if you look at the Palestinian landscape in the West Bank and Gaza, you see the PA is considered corrupt, the Palestinian Authority. They haven't had election for so long. They were supposed to have one, but they canceled it, right? They killed an activist, Nizar Banat, I think it was a few months ago. He was detained and then he died in detention. That created protests, but the PLO or the PA kind of crushed it. That is not helping. And the fact that Hamas, the groups like Hamas, are more willing to take risk, and kind of a lot of people view the May war as a success for Hamas because they prevented the eviction of the families. That's what people perceive, the evictions of the families in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, as a success. So even if they're personally not religious, looking at the failure of secular groups pushes a lot of them into that route. And religious conservatives, groups like Hamas do prosper on injustices and inequalities and corruption because that they show themselves as the opposite of that, right? And that's more tempting for younger people.
Ask one more question, if I may.
Go right ahead.
Actually, I'd like to offer a comment on what Dr. Fuller said. One of the points he made, younger generation being more liberal and older people being more conservative. I think it has been observed in many societies that the same younger generation, when it becomes old, it becomes more conservative. And this cycle goes on. It's not that this distinction is absolute and categorical. Roles keep switching. Liberal become conservative, and then the younger generation again liberal, again becomes conservative. So this cycle, I think, has been observed in some societies. My question is, are there any elements of religious conservatism that are common to Israeli and Palestinian politics? Any elements common to these?
Do you want me to go first, Adam? Or?
Well, I could just say really quickly, they're both anti-Zionist. That's a common element. And when you're talking about the Kahanists anyway, there might be. I think there could be for every. I said before at the end of my talk that it's Mansour Abbas who's going to maintain this religious conservatism for religious Jews that are
on
no longer
social aspects. Yeah, on social aspects, they have a lot of similarities, as you mentioned. LGBTQI rights, the separation, having personal status, issues considered in religious court, civil marriage, they're against it. Gay marriage, they're against it. So socially, they are way closer to religious groups, Israeli groups, than they are to the joint list members like Hadash, Balad, and all of them. So that's why I always laugh. It's like, seriously, like Ram is, when it comes to social issues, they don't make sense with Balad and Hadash. But politically, they are a bit divergent. But now there's a question mark on a lot of issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I don't know what the long-term strategy is, and I can't judge because it's not clear and nobody will tell you the truth, right?
It's the problem being an historian. Nobody writes down their ulterior motives.
Yes.
I have one quick question, but I want to give students the right to answer, to put one thing in. I know that it's getting late, and I'll ask it while they consider. I'm just curious what the fight is around cannabis, and I presume some students may be interested as well.
So the bill was supposed to legalize medical cannabis for people who need it, right? But religiously, cannabis is, as any substance, is considered not to be something that is allowed. Even though a lot of groups like ISIS, the Taliban, and all, they're known for like drug trafficking and selling drugs because they're profitable, but they also think it's a strategy because a lot of people who use drugs are Westerners, so why would we care? It's not our people that are using it, which is a fascinating way to look at it. So Abbas left it to the Shura Council, like the Islamic movement part, And the Shura Council said no. But eventually he voted and said he supported the bill. So it's all about religious morality in that sense. I don't know about the Jewish side. I'm assuming it's kind of similar.
Well, it's not terribly different. You know, that religious Jews believe that it's sinful to harm your body, and cannabis has that potential. And although there was actually a religious Zionist party that was pushing for cannabis legalization, not just for medical use, but for recreational use, led by Moshe Feiglin, who is a well-known figure in Israel, who used to be a Likudnik and then founded his own party, primarily as a one-issue party. You know, he was trying, of course, he sides with Bennett on most of these other issues, but he was primarily interested in legalizing cannabis. He ended up not getting enough seats to be in the government in the election he ran in, the first election. So then in the second election, instead of running, he made a deal with Netanyahu. The deal was that I won't run and take votes away from you if you promise, if you're elected prime minister, to legalize marijuana.
So there's one more question, but it's a very big one. And we only have a few minutes left.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask it, and maybe we'll play hot seat like on game shows. But it's worth at least asking, and I know we can't answer it now. One of the reasons it's going to be difficult to answer is that it calls for tremendous speculation. What would happen if? But if the two-state solution happens, would the parties in each nation be willing to have friendly or at least peaceful relations between the two states?
Well, I'm a political scientist, so I can answer the question by putting it through an equation, putting all these parameters in. So I'll get to that. I'll work on it, and I'll let you know.
I mean, it would be nice to create simulations, like computer simulation, and see what happens. So there are extremists, people on both sides that don't want that to end. Settlers want to keep expanding, right? Because they view as their right to, live in the West Bank. This is the religious right. And on the Palestinian side, there are people who want to have the right to kind of live in all historic Palestine. And they will always exist. I don't think that will go away. Now, I do think we could create institutions that will enable stability and cultural exchange and more understanding. That will take time to rebuild. Of course, trust as well is an issue that needs to be worked on. But anyway, any two states that need to be formed need to be equal, right? And that's where the issue comes. Because Israel, even if they agreed to having a second state, I'm sure they're like Palestinian state won't have a military, which is a problem because you can't be a fully operating state without your own military. So it could happen. Now there are lots of
question about that point that you just made. I know we're running out of time, but you can have a fully operating state without a military if you have the protection of others, like Japan, right? Or Germany after the war.
But because of lack of trust, who would that be?
Well, could it be another? Could it be a European country? I mean, there are a host of countries that might be willing to do that.
But why would they view it as fair?
Or how about the UAE now with the Abraham Accords, right? Something.
I don't know how they feel about the UAE with the Abraham Accord. But also it's about, a lot of people, it is about fairness, right? Justice, and that's not just. That's what people will tell you. What is justice? Every time I talk to an activist and say, do you define yourself as a peace activist? They're like, no, I'm a justice activist, because peace is about pacifying one group of people. It's not about giving them justice. And I thought that was the most fascinating way to put it. Like, it just opened my mind to that. And I think a lot of people will have problems with it for legitimate reasons when it comes to it. So Yeah, eventually it could happen. I'm not going to say that it's not possible, but it's going to take a long, long time, and we are not even taking the first step to going there, right? So I don't know.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank everybody who participated here today. It was lovely to see so many of you sign up. I want to thank Dr.
Yes.
Anwar Mahajani, who is visiting from Stonehill College, my colleague, Dr. Adam Fuller from just one floor below my office, and the same to my collaborator in this ongoing project, Dr. Mustanza Mir. So thank you all. And I will post this to our, at least the webpage of the Center for Judaic Studies as soon as possible, and get it up on all sorts of social media. So if you like this and want to share this conversation with people, you'll be able to do that too. Have a great weekend, stay safe, get vaccinated, and enjoy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.